The agency's letter arrived on a Tuesday, and the man at the Cheyenne office read it twice before he allowed himself to believe what it said. A widow, 4 sons, ages 4 through 14. He set the paper down on his desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood, the way a man does when the floor feels like it's shifting beneath him. Gideon Voss had filled out every form correctly. He had answered every question the agency asked. He had specified in plain language that he was a widower seeking one companion, one partner, one woman, willing to work hard and expect nothing easy. He had not asked for a family. He had not asked for children. He had specifically, deliberately, and in writing asked for none of those things. And yet in 4 days, a train was arriving from St. Louis. And on that train was Clara Whitmore, and 4 boys who called her mother. If this were a story about a better man, he would have sent a telegram immediately. He would have explained the misunderstanding, arranged for the agency to intercept, made sure she arrived somewhere that could actually use her. But Gideon Voss was not that man. He was the man who sat at his desk until the candle burned low, reading that letter a 3rd time and then a 4th, as if the words might eventually rearrange themselves into something he could live with. They did not. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button before this story is over, because if you think you know where this is going, you don't. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The Voss Ranch sat 11 miles southeast of Cheyenne, far enough from town that the sound of other people's lives never quite reached it. 340 acres of grassland and hard soil, a main house that had once held a family and now held only the echo of 1, 2 barns in varying stages of repair, and a bunkhouse where 4 ranch hands lived in the specific kind of quiet that men develop when their employer doesn't encourage conversation. Gideon had built most of it himself, not from scratch. His first wife, Margaret, had inherited the land from her father, and the house had already been standing when they arrived. But everything that mattered, every fence line and water trough and reinforced stall door, those were his. He knew every nail. He knew which boards in the kitchen floor creaked in winter and which gate latch froze solid in January, and how to coax the south well pump back to life when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. He had learned all of it the hard way, the way most men in Wyoming learn things, which was by being wrong about them first. Margaret had died in the spring of 1881. Fever, the doctor said, though Gideon suspected it was something more complicated than that, something to do with the 3rd winter in a row where the supply wagon hadn't made it through, and the way she'd been coughing since November and insisting it was nothing. He had believed her. That was the part he had never forgiven himself for. Not the fever, not the cold, the believing her. After she was gone, he kept working the ranch because stopping wasn't something he knew how to do. The cattle didn't care that he was grieving. The fence lines didn't wait for him to finish mourning. He got up every morning before dawn and went to work and came back inside after dark and ate whatever was left in the kitchen and went to sleep. And then he did it again the next day, and the day after that, until 3 years had passed, and he couldn't have told you, if you'd asked him, what any of those days had actually felt like. His foreman, a weathered man named Dutch Keller, who had been with him since the beginning, had brought up the marriage agency idea the previous September. Not gently, and not with much tact, which was the only way Dutch ever brought up anything. "You need somebody in that house," Dutch had said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "The place is going sideways, meals are wrong, supply orders are getting missed. You're too tired to think straight by noon." "I manage," Gideon said. "You survive," Dutch said. "That's not the same thing." Gideon had walked away from that conversation without answering, which was his way of admitting the man was right. He had filled out the agency forms 6 weeks later. The train was 20 minutes late, which gave Gideon 20 additional minutes to stand on the Cheyenne platform in December, cold and reconsider every decision he'd made in the past 3 months. The platform was busy for a Tuesday, families meeting relatives, a cattle buyer arguing with a porter about luggage, 2 women in heavy wool coats sharing something from a paper bag. Gideon stood apart from all of it, hat pulled low, hands shoved in his coat pockets, watching the tracks. He had not sent the telegram. He told himself it was because there hadn't been time. He told himself it was because the agency should be the one handling it. He told himself a lot of things on the ride into town, none of which he entirely believed. The truth, which he hadn't examined too closely, was that he didn't know what he was going to say when she stepped off that train, and he wasn't sure he wanted to figure it out before he had to. The train came in with the usual noise, the screech of brakes, the exhalation of steam, the sudden organized chaos of passengers beginning to move. Gideon watched the car doors open. He watched the platform fill with people. He scanned faces the way you do when you're looking for a stranger you've never met, which is to say he didn't entirely know what he was looking for. Then the second car's door opened, and a woman appeared at the top of the steps. She was holding a carpet bag in one hand and the railing in the other, and she was looking down at the steps with the focused attention of someone who was not about to let this platform see her stumble. Dark coat, dark hair pinned under a hat that had seen better days, straight-backed in the particular way that suggested the straightness cost her something. Behind her, at the top of the steps, was a boy, maybe 14. He was carrying two bags, one in each hand, and he was watching the platform with the flat, assessing look of someone who had learned to take stock of new places quickly. Then a smaller boy appeared behind him. Then another. Then a fourth, the youngest, maybe 4 years old, who grabbed the back of the older boy's coat to navigate the steps and didn't let go when they reached the bottom. 4 boys. Gideon counted them twice. Clara Whitmore stepped onto the frozen platform, turned, and found him immediately. He didn't know how she managed that. There were 30 people on that platform, but she looked straight at him with the directness of someone who had been rehearsing this moment and was done putting it off. She walked toward him. The boys followed. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. A pause that lasted approximately 1 century. "The agency told me," she began. "I received the letter," he said, 4 days ago." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. More like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "How many days did you have before you needed to respond?" 3. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, as if that answered a question she hadn't asked out loud. "So you didn't send a telegram?" "No." "But you came to the station?" "Yes." She shifted the carpet bag from one hand to the other. The eldest boy was still watching Gideon with that measuring look. The youngest had transferred his grip from his brother's coat to his mother's sleeve. Gideon looked at the 4 of them, actually looked at them, the way you have to eventually, and felt something in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. "I should have told them about the children from the start," Clara said. "I asked the agency to disclose that information. I was told they would. They didn't. I know that now." She kept her chin level. "I'm not here to make trouble for you, Mr. Voss. If you tell us to get back on the train, we'll get back on the train. I won't pretend that's an easy thing, but I won't ask you to take on something you weren't prepared for." Gideon looked at the youngest boy. He was watching Gideon with huge dark eyes, still holding his mother's sleeve, and there was something in the way he did it, that specific combination of wariness and hope, that made Gideon feel for just a second like the worst version of himself. "It's 11 miles to the ranch," he said finally. "The wagon's out front. It's too cold to stand here talking." Clara Whitmore studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Ethan, take your brothers." The eldest boy, Ethan, gave Gideon one more long look, and then he turned and began organizing his siblings toward the station door with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Gideon picked up one of the bags. He didn't look at Clara when he did it. He just picked it up and carried it toward the door, and she fell in step beside him, and neither of them said another word about it until they were already moving. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and it was not a comfortable one. Gideon drove. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the 4 boys arranged themselves in the bed behind them with a kind of practiced quiet that told him they were used to making themselves small. The youngest, Noah, he would learn, though he didn't ask names yet, fell asleep against his brother's arm before they'd gone 2 miles. The wind had picked up since morning. It came off the open grassland in long, flat gusts that cut through wool like the wool wasn't there. Gideon had driven this road in worse, but that was alone, which was a different kind of cold. Beside him, Clara sat without complaint, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the road ahead. "Where are you from, Sut?" he asked, mostly to fill the silence. "St. Louis, originally. Before that, Ohio." "Long way to come." "Yes." He let that sit. A quarter mile passed. The wagon hit a rough patch and swayed, and in the bed behind them he heard one of the boys catch himself against the sideboards. "Their father," he said, and then stopped, because he hadn't planned the question out. "2 years ago," she said, without making him finish it. "Influenza. He was sick for 9 days. Gideon said nothing. "He was a good man," Clara said, in a tone that was neither sentimental nor defensive, just factual, the way you state something you've had 2 years to make peace with. "He wasn't a man who planned well, but he tried hard, and he was kind to them, and that counts for something." "It does," Gideon said, and meant it. Another quarter-mile. "I know this wasn't what you agreed to," she said. "I'm not asking you to pretend it was." "I'm not pretending anything," he said. "I know, I can tell." She turned to look at him, and he felt the look even though he kept his eyes on the road. "That's either a good sign or a bad one. I haven't decided which." He almost said something to that. He swallowed it back. The ranch came into view just before the light started going gray. The main house first, then the barns, the fence lines, the weather vane on the smaller barn that had been stuck pointing northeast for 2 years because he kept forgetting to fix it. He watched her take it in. He couldn't tell what she thought of it. "It's not much for looking at," he said. "Looking at doesn't matter," she said. He drove the wagon into the yard and pulled up in front of the house. Dutch came out of the barn immediately. Of course he did. The man had probably been watching the road for an hour, and stopped cold when he saw the boys climbing out of the wagon bed. His expression did something complicated. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him. "Dutch Keller," Gideon said. "This is Mrs. Whitmore." Dutch pulled his hat off. "Ma'am." "Mr. Keller," she said. Her voice was even. Dutch looked at the boys again. The youngest had woken up when the wagon stopped and was now standing in the yard looking around with the unfocused wonder of a child who has just arrived somewhere new and hasn't decided yet whether it's good or frightening. The second youngest, Miles, Gideon would learn, was already studying the barn with a look of intent curiosity. Caleb, the second oldest, stood still and patient. Ethan stood close to his mother but slightly in front of her, which was a positioning Gideon recognized. He'd seen men stand that way before, usually not boys. "I'll get the horses settled," Dutch said, which was the most diplomatic thing Gideon had ever heard him say. The house was cold. Gideon hadn't lit the stove before he left that morning because he hadn't expected to need it until evening, and evening had arrived earlier than planned. He got the fire going in the kitchen first, then the main room, and by the time he'd managed both, Clara had found the kitchen supplies with a directness that suggested she'd already taken inventory of the room in the first 90 seconds. "What do you usually eat in the evenings?" she asked, her back to him as she opened a cabinet. "Whatever's there," he said. She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "That's not an answer." "Salt pork, beans. Sometimes I get a proper cut from the butcher in town." "When did you last get a proper cut from the butcher?" He thought about it. "October." She turned back to the cabinet and said nothing, and somehow that was worse than if she'd said something. The boys drifted through the house with varying degrees of restraint. Noah wandered immediately, touching things, peering into rooms, narrating what he found in a low murmur that was clearly aimed at no one in particular. Miles stayed near the kitchen. Caleb sat down at the table and waited with his hands folded, watching his mother move around the kitchen with an attention that was almost adult. Ethan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, neither in nor out of either space, watching Gideon. "You can sit down," Gideon said. "I'm fine," Ethan said. Gideon set another log on the fire. "How old are you?" 14. "What did you do back in St. Louis?" A pause. "Worked when there was work. Helped my mother." "With what?" Ethan's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "Whatever needed doing," he said, which Gideon recognized meant everything. He didn't push it. Clara made supper from what was there, salt pork after all, because that was what there was, but with something done to the onions and the dried beans that made the whole thing taste like a meal rather than just food. The boys ate without complaint. Noah finished his bowl and immediately asked if there was more, and Clara said there was, and that was the first time Gideon saw her smile, just briefly, just at the boy. And it changed her face in a way he hadn't expected. After supper, Gideon showed them where they would sleep. There were 2 spare rooms, both of which had been empty since Margaret's last sister visited in the summer of 1880. He'd put clean bedding on the beds that morning. That much he'd managed. And though the rooms were plain and cold, they were dry. The boys went to bed with almost no resistance, which surprised him until he remembered they had traveled since before dawn. Noah was asleep before Clara had finished tucking the blanket around him. Miles was close behind. Caleb settled in with the quietness of someone who had learned to fall asleep quickly and not make it look like a skill. Ethan stayed up longer than the others, sitting on the edge of the bed in the room he'd been assigned, looking at the wall. "You don't have to watch me," Gideon said from the doorway. Ethan looked at him. "I know," he said. And then, after a pause, "Do you want us here?" The directness of it caught Gideon sideways. 14 years old and already asking the question most adults spent their whole lives working around. He considered lying. He considered the diplomatic middle ground version that wasn't quite a lie. Instead, he said, "I'm not sure what I want yet, that's honest." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "That's fair," he said. Gideon went back down the hall. Clara was in the kitchen, washing the supper dishes in a basin of water she must have heated herself. "You don't need to do that tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He sat down at the kitchen table. The fire in the stove had gotten the room warm enough that it no longer hurt to breathe the air, which was an improvement over the afternoon. "I'll write to the agency in the morning," he said. "Explain the situation." Clara kept washing. Her back was to him. "And say what?" "That there was a misunderstanding, that I need some time to figure out." He stopped. "Some time," she repeated. Not sarcastically, just noting it. "I'm not throwing you out in the cold," he said. "I know." She set a plate on the drying cloth. "But I need to know what I'm planning for, Mr. Voss. I have 4 children. I don't have the luxury of waiting to see how a situation develops." "That's fair," he said, which was what Ethan had said, and he wondered if the boy had learned it from her or if they'd arrived at it separately. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight, her face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's travel. It was the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying weight for a long time and is very good at not letting it show. "Can we stay through the winter?" she asked. "Just that. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking if we can stay until the snow breaks so I can find something on the other side of it." Gideon thought about the 4 boys asleep down the hall. He thought about the way Noah had asked for seconds, and the way Ethan had looked at him from the doorway, and the way Caleb had sat with his hands folded, patient and still, like a child who had learned that patience was the safest available option. "Through the winter," he said. "Yes." Clara turned back to the dishes. "Thank you," she said. It was not a warm moment. It was not a tender one. There was no music behind it, no softening of the hard edges. It was just 2 people in a cold house at the edge of a Wyoming winter, agreeing to tolerate each other's presence until the weather permitted something better. But Gideon sat at that table for a long time after she finished the dishes and went to bed, staring at the fire in the stove, and he couldn't have explained why. The first week was an education in how wrong he'd been about his own house. He had believed, for 3 years, that he was managing adequately. He had managed the cattle and the land and the hands and the books, and those things were all moving forward in the specific way that things move forward when someone is holding them together through sheer stubbornness. He had not noticed, or had noticed and chosen not to examine, the parts that weren't moving forward at all. Clara noticed in about 4 days. The supply system was the first thing. He'd been ordering from the Cheyenne merchant in rough approximation, guessing at quantities, usually running short on some things and long on others in a pattern that repeated itself, and that he had somehow failed to identify as a pattern. Clara found his ledger on the second morning, sat down with it at the kitchen table, and spent an hour going through it with the methodical attention of someone who had done this before. She didn't say anything about what she found. She just wrote a list and gave it to him and said, "This is what we need before the end of the month." He looked at the list. It was specific. It was accurate. He knew it was accurate because she had written down the exact things that had been wrong, and he hadn't been able to name them. "How did you—" he started. "My husband had a dry goods business for a while," she said, "before it failed. I kept the books." She picked up her coffee cup, which she had found and cleaned and clearly felt she'd earned the right to use. "I know what a supply shortfall looks like." The second thing was the kitchen, which she reorganized with a thoroughness that made him realize he'd been storing things incorrectly since Margaret died. He hadn't known that what Margaret did in the kitchen was a system. He'd thought it was just where she kept things. But Clara moved through it with the certainty of someone reverse engineering an existing structure, and within 2 days it worked better than it had in years. The third thing was harder to name. It was something to do with the house itself. Not what was in it, but how it felt to be in it. The rooms that had been shut were still shut. He hadn't opened them. But the kitchen and the main room were warmer now, not just in temperature, but in some quality he didn't have language for. And he caught himself noticing it in the evenings when he came in from the barn, and the smell of supper was already in the air, and there was noise, actual noise, the specific noise of children existing in a space coming from somewhere inside. He didn't know what to do with that, so he mostly just kept working and tried not to think about it. Dutch found him in the barn on the 4th day, which meant Dutch had been waiting for what he considered an appropriate amount of time. "She's something," Dutch said, leaning on the stall door. "She is," Gideon said, and kept working. "Those boys aren't bad either. The oldest one, Ethan. He asked me this morning if there was anything he could do to help. Didn't wait to be asked, just offered." Gideon set down the tool he was using and looked at Dutch. "What?" Dutch said, sad with the expression of a man who knows exactly what. "Don't," Gideon said. "I'm just reporting what happened." "No, you're not." Dutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know you didn't plan for this. I know that's not nothing. But those kids slept in a warm room last night, and that woman fixed the supply list in 40 minutes that you've been fighting with for 2 years, and the house—" He stopped. "I can hear people in that house from the barn, Gideon. That hasn't happened since—" "I know when it happened," Gideon said. Dutch nodded. He pushed off the stall door. "Just saying," he said, and walked out. Gideon stood in the barn for a while after that. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. The letter from the agency came on the 9th day. Gideon opened it alone at the kitchen table before anyone else was awake. Outside, the first serious snowfall of the season was starting. Not the heavy kind yet, but the preliminary kind, the kind that was telling you what was coming. The letter was from a Mr. Raymond Holt, agency administrator, and it was professionally apologetic in the way that organizations are professionally apologetic when they've made an error that cost someone else something significant. The gist of it was this. There had been a clerical failure. Clara Whitmore's file had been processed without the notation about her children. This was an error the agency took full responsibility for. As a gesture of good faith, they were writing to inform both parties that Clara had, pending Mr. Voss's decision, been identified as a potential match for another client. A merchant in Denver, a widower, no objection to children, good financial standing. There was a specific sentence near the end of the letter that Gideon read 3 times. "Should you choose to release Mrs. Whitmore from the current arrangement, we are prepared to facilitate her placement at no further cost to either party. Release her." He set the letter down. Through the kitchen window, the snow was coming down harder now. The yard was already going white, and in the room down the hall, he could hear Noah beginning to wake up. That particular sequence of small sounds a child makes when they're not quite ready to be awake, but no longer quite asleep, half words and small protests, and the creak of the rope bed frame. Gideon folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. He got up and started the stove. He didn't know what he was going to do. He knew he had to tell her. He knew he couldn't make this decision for her, that the letter changed what she could choose. He knew that the merchant in Denver was probably, by any practical measure, a better situation than a Wyoming ranch 11 miles from the nearest town, with a man who was still learning how to be in the same house as other people. He knew all of that. But he also knew, he stood at the stove and he could not lie to himself about it, that the idea of the house going back to what it had been felt like something with weight and edges, like picking up a stone and holding it against your chest. Clara came into the kitchen 20 minutes later. She took in the state of the stove, the coffee already going, and his expression in about 4 seconds. "Something happened," she said. He pulled the letter from his pocket and set it on the table. She read it standing up. She didn't sit down to read it. She read it the way she did most things, straight through, without interrupting herself. And then she set it back on the table and was quiet for a moment. "Denver," she said. "That's what it says." "A merchant." "Good financial standing," he said. That's what they put. She was quiet again. Outside, the snow was still falling. What do you want me to do? She asked. It was a simple question, and it hit him somewhere below the ribs in a way he hadn't expected. Not because of what it implied about the future, but because of what it revealed about the present. That she was asking him, that she was standing in his kitchen reading a letter about her own future and asking what he wanted. That's not mine to decide, he said. I know. She picked up the letter again, looked at it, set it back down. But you have a stake in it. You have a life here. Whatever happens, I need to know what you actually want, not what you think the correct thing to say is. He looked at her. She looked back. I don't want you to go, he said. The words came out plainer than he intended. He hadn't planned them out, and they showed. That's what I want. That's the truth. But I know that's not. I know there are things you have to weigh that I can't weigh for you. Clara Whitmore stood in his kitchen in the early morning light, with 4 sons asleep down the hall, and snow falling outside and a letter on the table between them. And she looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she picked up the letter and folded it and put it in her apron pocket. I'll think about it, she said, and she began making breakfast. He didn't know what that meant. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and watched the snow fall and tried to figure out whether he'd said too much or not enough, or exactly the wrong thing entirely. He was still sitting there when the first of the boys appeared in the doorway. Noah, hair flattened on one side, eyes half open, dragging a blanket behind him like a tail. The boy looked at Gideon, then he climbed into the chair across the table without asking permission and pulled the blanket up to his chin and regarded Gideon with the particular seriousness of a 4-year-old who has something important to say. It's snowing, Noah said. It is, Gideon said. A lot? Getting there. Noah considered this. Then he said, Is that bad? Gideon thought about it. Not yet, he said. Ask me again in February. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned to watch the window. And Gideon, looking at this child he had not agreed to, and had not planned for, and had not asked to have sitting across from him at 6 a.m, telling him it was snowing outside, felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. Something earlier than that. Something that preceded it the way the preliminary snow preceded the real storm. Just the first suggestion of what was on its way. Clara did not bring up the letter again that day, or the day after, and Gideon did not push it. He told himself this was patience. He told himself he was giving her space to think. He was at least partially lying to himself, because the real reason he didn't push it was that he was afraid of what she would say, and he understood, somewhere he didn't examine too closely, that this fear itself was information. A man who had not been moved by a woman's presence would not be afraid of her answer. The snow from that morning kept falling through the afternoon and into the evening, not the blizzard kind, just the persistent kind, the kind that piled up quietly on fence posts and window sills while you were busy with other things. By nightfall, the yard had 4 inches, and the temperature had dropped enough that the water in the outer trough froze along the edges. Gideon broke the ice before he came inside, which was a task he had always done alone, and would always do alone, and he was thinking about this. The ordinary loneliness of necessary tasks, when he came back through the kitchen door and found Clara still at the table at 9 o'clock at night with his supply ledger open in front of her. Not just open, annotated. She had a pencil in her hand and was writing in the margin in a careful, small hand, and she didn't look up when he came in. You're still at that, he said. The numbers from October are wrong, she said. Not badly wrong, but the beef tallow order was short, and you were charged as if it wasn't, and nobody caught it. He took off his coat and hung it by the door. How much? $1.40. It's not the money. It's the pattern. She turned the book toward him and pointed at the column. Look at November last year. Same merchant. Short on lamp oil. Charged full. 2 months before that, salt. Same thing. He looked. She was right. He had not looked that carefully, in part because looking that carefully at the books required a kind of sustained attention that he'd been running short on for going on 3 years. I'll send a letter, he said. I already wrote it, she said. It's on the sideboard. You just need to sign it. He stood there for a moment. She had turned back to the ledger. Clara, he said. You don't have to do this tonight. She looked up then, and the expression on her face was not quite irritation and not quite something else. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm doing it because it needs doing and because it gives me something to think about besides. She stopped. She looked back at the ledger. The boys will need boots before this winter gets any worse. Ethan's pair has a split sole. I don't want to ask you for money. I just want you to know that's a thing I'm trying to work out. It was the first time she had mentioned needing anything. He understood this was not easy for her. He understood this because it was also not easy for him, and they were different people in most respects, but apparently not in that one. I'll take him to the merchant in town on Friday, Gideon said. Clara nodded. She kept looking at the ledger. He signed the letter on the sideboard and went to bed, and he lay awake longer than he should have, listening to the house settle around him in the cold. What happened over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic. That was the thing Gideon found most difficult to account for. The way the change crept into the ranch. The way cold crept into a room, not through any single visible gap, but through 100 small places at once, until the whole temperature of the thing was different without your being able to point to the moment it had shifted. Clara did not take over. That was what surprised him most. He had been braced for it, in the quiet defensive way he was braced for most things. Ready to feel crowded, ready to feel managed, ready to feel the particular resentment of a man who has been alone long enough to mistake solitude for preference. But she didn't crowd him. She moved through the house and the day with a kind of practical intelligence that somehow occupied space without filling it, and the things she changed were almost always things he hadn't noticed needed changing until after she'd changed them. The kitchen was warm when he came in for meals now. That was first and most basic. She had figured out the stove's specific temperament. It ran hot on the left side and needed banking differently than most. And she managed it in a way that meant the kitchen was reliably warm by the time anyone needed it to be, which had not been true in years. He knew, rationally, that this was a small thing. He also knew, in the specific way of a man who had come inside at dusk to a cold house several hundred times, that it was not small at all. The second thing was the food. He had told her the truth. He ate what was there, and what was there was usually salt pork and beans and whatever he could manage that didn't require too many steps. Clara made meals that tasted like someone cared about them. She didn't do it with fancy ingredients because there were none. She did it with attention, which cost nothing and was apparently rarer than he'd realized. Dutch Keller ate supper at the house on the third Thursday, invited by no one specific and turned away by no one, and afterward he caught Gideon near the barn and said, "That woman just made something remarkable out of dried onions and bad flour." "She makes it work," Gideon said. "It's not just the food," Dutch said, and walked off before Gideon could tell him to let it go. The boys were their own kind of education. Gideon had not spent time around children since, he didn't calculate it, a long time, long enough that he'd stopped expecting to. He had no particular theory about how to behave around them, and he didn't develop one. He just behaved the way he behaved and watched what happened. Noah was the easiest. The 4-year-old approached the world with a thoroughness that Gideon found genuinely entertaining, even when it was inconvenient. The child investigated everything: the barn, the bunkhouse, the spaces between things, the underside of the kitchen table, the interior of the woodbox. He asked questions in the continuous stream of a person for whom curiosity had not yet become embarrassing, and he accepted answers with the same uncritical seriousness, regardless of who gave them. On the 6th day, he informed Gideon, at breakfast, that the weather vane on the small barn was pointing the wrong way. "It's stuck," Gideon said. "How long has it been stuck?" Gideon thought about it. "About 2 years." Noah looked at him. The expression was not judgmental exactly, but it was thorough. "You should fix it," he said. "I know." "Do you want me to fix it?" Gideon looked at the 4-year-old across the table. "I appreciate the offer," he said. Miles was harder to read. The 8-year-old moved through space with a careful, self-contained quality that reminded Gideon of certain animals he'd known. Horses that were not skittish, just watchful, who took their time deciding whether a new thing was safe. Miles didn't talk much, but he watched things. He watched the way the barn's south wall met the foundation with the specific attention of someone who had already figured out that the wood was wrong there, that moisture was getting in. On the second week, Gideon found him crouched in the corner of the small barn with a stick, testing the ground near the wall. "It's rotting," Miles said without looking up. "I know," Gideon said. "Has it been like that long?" "Since last spring." Miles was quiet for a moment, still looking at the wall. "I could help fix it," he said. If you show me how. Gideon looked at the 8-year-old with the same assessment he'd have given a new hand. Can you follow directions and not rush? Yes, Miles said, with a certainty that was either genuine or a very convincing imitation. Saturday, Gideon said. We'll start Saturday. Miles nodded and stood up and walked back toward the house like it was settled, which apparently it was. Caleb was something else entirely. 11 years old, the second oldest, quiet in a different way than Miles. Miles was quiet because he was occupied with things he was examining. Caleb was quiet because he was occupied with things he was thinking. He read. He had brought 3 books in his bag from St. Louis and had already finished 2 of them by the end of the first week. And on the 8th day he found Gideon's small collection on the shelf in the main room and stood in front of it for a long time without touching anything. You can take one if you want, Gideon said from the doorway. Caleb looked at him. Is that all right? That's why I said it. Caleb pulled out a book on cattle management that had been there since Margaret's father's time and sat down with it at the table. Gideon sat across from him, working on a piece of tack that needed mending, and they spent an hour in the same room without talking, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Gideon had experienced in 3 years. Later, Caleb asked him, without looking up from the book, is it true that the soil chemistry in this part of Wyoming changes how the grass grows in summer? Gideon looked at him. What page is that on? 43. It references it, but doesn't explain it. Gideon set down the tack. Yes, he said. It's true. The alkaline content in the soil here runs high, changes what the cattle will and won't graze. Caleb turned to page 43 and made a note in the margin with a stub of pencil he apparently carried in his pocket. How do you manage it? And Gideon, who had not been asked a question about his own land by someone who actually wanted to know the answer in longer than he could remember, told him. Ethan was the last and the most difficult, and Gideon understood why. The boy was 14 and had been the man of his family for 2 years. Not in title, not anyone had given him that role officially, but in practice, in the specific practice of being the oldest child in a house where the father was gone and the mother was doing her best, and someone needed to watch the gaps. Ethan watched the gaps. He had been watching them since he was 12 years old, and it had turned him into someone who was simultaneously more capable and more rigid than a 14-year-old had any business being. He helped without being asked. He was competent. He was unfailingly, almost aggressively responsible. He never complained, and he never, in the first 2 weeks, allowed himself to act like a boy. Not once. He moved through the ranch with the deliberate carefulness of someone who had decided that the safest way to be in a new place was to be useful, and that the safest way to be useful was to never stop. Gideon recognized this. He recognized it the way you recognize a face you've seen in a mirror. He didn't push. He didn't try to tell Ethan to relax because nothing makes a person less relaxed than being told to relax. He just let the boy work. And he worked alongside him when it made sense. And he started talking. Not about anything significant, just about the work itself, the way men talk when they're doing something with their hands. Which fence line ran which way? Why the east pasture drained better than the west? What the cattle's behavior in November could tell you about February. On the 11th day, Ethan made a mistake. They were reinforcing a section of fence in the north pasture, and Ethan had been setting posts, and he'd gotten 2 of them in the wrong position, which wasn't immediately obvious but would have created a weak point in the line that would fail under any real pressure. Gideon saw it and stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just crouched down and looked at the post. Ethan saw him looking and went rigid. I did it wrong, he said. Flat. No question. The angle's off, Gideon said. We can fix it. I should have measured more carefully. You should have, Gideon said. We'll pull it and reset it. It happens. Ethan was quiet. Then he said, I didn't want to do it wrong. There was something in his voice that had nothing to do with fence posts, and both of them knew it. Gideon looked at him. Doing it wrong is how you learn to do it right, he said. That's not a comfort, I know, but it's true. Ethan looked at the post for a moment. Then he said, My father used to say that. His voice was carefully neutral. I never believed him either. Gideon almost smiled. He didn't, quite. Pull the post, he said. We'll reset it properly. Ethan pulled the post. They reset it. They didn't talk about the other thing, but something shifted, just slightly, just enough to be worth noting. in the way the boys stood when they went back to work. Clara found Gideon in the barn on the 12th evening, which was unusual. She didn't come to the barn. She managed the house. He managed everything outside it, and they had fallen into this division not by discussion, but by the natural gravity of their respective competencies. When she appeared in the barn doorway, he knew without being told that something had happened. "Miles got into a fight," she said. He set down the harness. "With who?" "Two boys from the Hanson place. They were in town. They said something." She stopped. She pressed her lips together in the specific way of someone deciding how much to say. "About us. About our situation. About the arrangement." "What did they say?" "That he was a charity case. That his mother couldn't get a real husband, so she got someone else's." She said it evenly, which cost her something. He could see what it cost her. Miles hit the older one hard enough to split his lip. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Is Miles hurt?" "Skinned knuckles. He's fine." She looked at him. "I told him fighting was wrong. I told him he should have walked away." A pause. "I don't entirely believe that, but I told him." He looked at her. She looked back. "Was he wrong?" Gideon asked. Clara was quiet. "He was protecting something," she said finally. "That's not the same as wrong, but it's not uncomplicated either." He picked up the harness again, not because it needed doing right then, but because he needed something to do with his hands. "I'll talk to him." "You don't have to." "I know." He set it down again. "I want to." Something moved across her face, surprise maybe, or something with a longer name that he didn't have available. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked away, and then she said, "He's in the kitchen," and went back inside. Miles was at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of warm water, looking at the table. His knuckles were scraped and swollen. He didn't look up when Gideon came in. Gideon pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at the boy's hands. "Show me," he said. Miles held out his hands. Gideon looked at them. The right one was worse. The middle two knuckles had broken the skin. It would be sore for a week. He'd had worse. "Clean?" he asked. "Ma cleaned them," Miles said. "Good." He sat back. "Tell me what happened." Miles told him. He told it plainly and without embellishment, which Gideon appreciated. Two boys from the Hanson farm, older, one of them maybe 12. They'd seen Miles in the merchants and said what Clara had reported. And Miles had told them to shut up, and they'd laughed, and he'd hit the older one. "Were you scared?" Gideon asked. Miles looked up. "No," he said. Then, after a second, "Yes, after, not before." "That's about right," Gideon said. "Fear that comes before is what stops you from doing things you shouldn't. Fear that comes after is how you know you understand what just happened." Miles looked at his hands. "My mother says I should have walked away." "Your mother is right," Gideon said. "And she's also raising you to be someone who doesn't walk away from things that matter, which means you're going to be in that situation again, and you're going to have to figure out every time which thing applies." Miles was quiet. Then he said, "What would you have done?" Gideon thought about it honestly, because the boy deserved an honest answer. "At your age? Probably the same thing you did. At this age?" He paused. "I'd have said something cold enough to make them feel small without giving them anything to swing at. That takes longer to learn." Miles looked at him. "What would you have said?" "I don't know yet," Gideon said. "I'm still learning that one myself." The boy's expression shifted. Not a smile, but the antecedent of one. The possibility of a smile held in check by a face that was still deciding whether this was a safe place for that kind of thing. "Your hands will be sore for a few days," Gideon said, standing. "Don't let it stop you working. Working through sore hands is good practice." "Okay," Miles said. Gideon went to the door. Then, without quite planning to, he turned and said, "What they said isn't true. About your mother. About the arrangement." He said it plainly, the way he'd have stated a fact about fence posts or winter weather. "I want you to know that." Miles looked at him for a long time. "How come you didn't just send us back?" he asked. "I thought about it," Gideon said. "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" It was again the kind of direct question only a child would ask, and he understood that the directness of it was not rudeness, but the specific honesty of someone who had learned from 2 hard years that the truth mattered more than tact. "Because it's a long ride back in the cold," he said, "and because you and your brothers were already asleep." Miles looked at him with those watchful eyes, and Gideon could see the boy turning this over, examining it from different angles the way he'd examined the rotting barn wall. "That's not the whole reason," Miles said. "No," Gideon said. "It's not." He went back inside, leaving it there. The thing Clara was doing to the ranch hand crew was harder to notice than what she was doing to the house, but Dutch pointed it out on the 15th day with the directness Gideon had always found either invaluable or exhausting, depending on the day. "The men are different," Dutch said. "They were in the barn. They were always in the barn when Dutch had something to say." "Different how?" Gideon said. "Pete showed up on time this week, 3 times. Pete was a hand who had been chronically, incorrigibly late since Gideon had hired him, a fault Gideon tolerated because Pete was otherwise reliable and hard to replace in December. And Tom fixed the east gate latch without being asked, and Wallace— "I get it," Gideon said. "She talked to them," Dutch said. "Clara. She talked to each of them, just asked them about themselves, what they were good at, where they came from. Normal things. But she listened like she meant it." He paused. "Men work different when someone's actually listening to them." Gideon knew this was true. He also knew that he himself had not, in 3 years, thought to ask his men where they came from or what they were good at beyond the specific tasks he needed them for. He had managed them correctly and fairly and without cruelty, but he had not listened to them. He had not had the capacity for it. "She's doing something to this place," Dutch said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Are you going to let her stay?" Gideon looked at him. "I know it's your business," Dutch said without backing down. "I'm asking anyway." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn door in its frame, and from somewhere across the yard he could hear Noah's voice. The boy was in the bunkhouse with Wallace, who had apparently and improbably allowed the 4-year-old to assist him in some project that involved a great deal of discussion and possibly a hammer. "I don't know yet," Gideon said. "She hasn't decided." Dutch looked at him. "Have you?" The question sat in the air between them. Gideon had a handful of honest answers, and none of them felt ready to say out loud. He could say that he thought about the empty house constantly now. Not its former emptiness, but its current fullness, the fact of it, the weight of it, in a way that made its future emptiness feel like something with edges sharp enough to cut. He could say that he had caught himself, twice, slowing down the tasks that kept him outside in the evenings because he was in no particular hurry to miss what was happening in the kitchen. He could say that watching Ethan straighten up just slightly when Gideon spoke to him, watching Miles look up from his careful examinations of things to check whether Gideon was nearby, watching Noah ask him questions with the assumption that the answers would be forthcoming. All of it had moved something in him that had been still for 3 years. He could say all of that. Instead, he said, "I need to check the north fence before dark," and walked out. Dutch watched him go without comment, which was the most tactful thing Dutch had ever done for him. Clara found the locked room on the 17th day. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, and it was simply locked, the key taken out and put somewhere she couldn't see. She didn't ask about it. She noticed it once, noted it, and didn't bring it up, which was the right thing to do and the thing he registered without being sure how to respond to. He had locked the room when Margaret died. Not immediately. It had taken him several months to get to it, to make himself turn the key. Inside was everything that had been hers. The clothes, the needlework, the small vanity mirror she'd brought from Ohio, a few letters from her family, a quilt she'd been working on that she never finished. He had not opened the room in 2.5 years. He told himself he was not ready. He had eventually stopped asking himself when he would be. But that evening, after supper, when the boys were in bed and Clara was finishing something in the kitchen, Gideon went to the kitchen shelf where he kept miscellaneous things, bolts, spare buckles, the key to the barn's inner room, and found the key to the locked room. He held it for a moment. Then he put it back on the shelf and went to bed. But he didn't sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about the question Miles had asked him. "Why didn't you just send us back?" And the answer he'd given, which was true but incomplete, and the complete answer, which he hadn't given because he hadn't been sure of it yet. He was sure of it now. He'd kept them because from the first moment he had seen those 4 boys on the station platform, Standing behind their mother in the frozen wind with their bags and their wariness and their exhausted, watchful faces, he had recognized something. Not in the abstract, specifically. He had recognized what it looked like to be holding yourself together through nothing but sheer commitment to the people depending on you. And he had understood, in a way he had not allowed himself to understand about his own life, that it was not the same as being fine. Clara was not fine. He was not fine. The boys were working very hard at the specific project of being fine, and that project was costing them things they couldn't afford to keep spending. He understood this because it was also exactly what he had been doing. He got up before dawn, went to the shelf, and took the key. He did not open the room, not that morning, but he held the key in his hand while he made the coffee, and he put it in his pocket instead of back on the shelf, and he thought that was, for now, enough. When Clara came into the kitchen 20 minutes later and found him at the table with his coffee and his silence, she looked at him once and then began her morning without comment, and he thought, watching her move through his kitchen with the specific competence of someone who had learned its every particular in 2.5 weeks, that this, right here, this ordinary, unremarkable morning, was something he had stopped believing he could have. The snow that day was the heavy kind, the real storm kind. And inside the house, the stove was already warm. The second letter from the agency arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the first. Gideon found it in the stack of mail Dutch had collected from the post office in town, sandwiched between a bill from the feed merchant and a notice about road conditions on the southern route. He recognized the agency's letterhead immediately. The same clean, formal print, the same careful language that managed to be both apologetic and businesslike in equal measure. And he set the rest of the mail down and read it standing at the kitchen table, alone, with the mid-morning light coming in flat through the window. Mr. Raymond Holt had written again. The Denver merchant, a Mr. Harold Fenn, 51 years old, owner of a dry goods establishment on Larimer Street, prosperous, stable, had been informed of the situation and remained interested. He had, in fact, expressed what the letter called particular understanding of Mrs. Whitmore's circumstances. He had children of his own, grown and out of the house. He was not opposed to a ready-made family. He had the means to provide well. The letter ended with a deadline. Not a cruel one, not stated harshly, but a deadline nonetheless. The agency needed to know by the 1st of January whether Mrs. Whitmore would be staying at the Voss Ranch under the original arrangement, or whether they should proceed with facilitating the Denver connection. January 1st was 17 days away. Gideon folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and went back outside. He spent the rest of the morning pulling a damaged section of fence line in the west pasture, which was work that required enough physical effort to make thinking difficult and not quite enough to make it impossible. The ground was frozen solid, and the post came out in pieces, and he cut his left hand on a piece of wire he hadn't seen, and by noon he had fixed the fence and was cold and irritated and no clearer on anything than he'd been at 9. He told Clara about the letter at supper. He waited until the boys were finished eating and Ethan had taken Noah to get ready for bed and Miles and Caleb had drifted into the main room, and then he put the letter on the table between them. She read it the way she read everything, straight through, no interruptions, no visible reaction until she was finished. When she set it down, she didn't say anything right away. She picked up her coffee cup and held it and looked at the letter. January 1st, she said. Yes. That's 17 days. I counted the same. She looked at him. What do you want me to do with this information, Gideon? It was the first time she'd used his given name, and neither of them remarked on it, but he felt it register somewhere. I want you to have it, he said. I don't think it's right that I'm the only one who knows about it. All right. She folded the letter and set it aside. And what are you going to do? I'm not going to do anything. That's not my decision. Part of it is, she said. Whether you want me to stay is part of it. He looked at her. She looked back. This was becoming a feature of their conversations. These moments where the ordinary protective evasions ran out, and they were just two people looking at each other with the uncomfortable clarity of people who had run out of polite ways to avoid a thing. I already told you what I want, he said. You told me you didn't want me to go. That's not the same as wanting me to stay. He opened his mouth and closed it again. She was right. There was a difference, and she had identified it precisely. And it irritated him because it was the kind of precision he appreciated in her and found inconvenient right now in equal measure. I want you to stay, he said. That's what I want. but I'm aware that what I want is not the primary consideration. Clara set down her coffee cup. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing words that are actually true rather than words that are appropriate. Harold Fenn in Denver is probably a decent man, she said. The agency wouldn't have matched me with someone they hadn't vetted. He has money. The boys would have good shoes and enough to eat, and no questions about where the next winter's supply order was coming from. She paused. Those things are not nothing. No, Gideon said. They're not. But I've been making decisions based on what was secure and available my whole life, she said. I married James Whitmore because he was steady and kind, and that seemed like enough. And he was steady and kind, and I don't regret it, and he's gone, and I still have 4 children to raise, and I'm 31 years old, and I am very tired of choosing the most available option. She stopped. She looked at the folded letter. That's not an answer. I'm just telling you where I am. I know where you are, he said. Do you? You're in the same place I've been for 3 years, he said. Making something work because making it work is what you do. And you're starting to wonder if there's a difference between making something work and actually wanting it. Clara looked at him for a long time. Something shifted in her expression, not towards softness exactly, but towards something more exposed. You're better at that than I expected, she said. At what? Saying the true thing. I'm not always, he said. Tonight is a good night for it. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Give me a few days, she said. You have 17, he said. I won't need that many, she said. I just need a few. He nodded. She took the letter and went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table for a while, alone, listening to the house. Somewhere above him, he heard Clara's footsteps, then Ethan's voice, low, then hers. He did not try to make out the words. He just listened to the fact of them. The storm came on the 4th day after the second letter, which was the kind of storm Wyoming produced in January. Not the worst he'd seen, but serious enough that by the time Gideon was up at 5 in the morning, the wind was hitting the north side of the house hard enough to make the window frames flex, and the temperature had dropped overnight to something the thermometer in the barn could barely register. He had known it was coming. He'd been watching the sky for 2 days. He'd spent Tuesday making sure the cattle were in the right pastures, checking the feed stores in both barns, making sure the bunkhouse was fully stocked with wood. He had done all of it with the methodical preparation of a man who had survived Wyoming winters long enough to know that the storms that killed you were the ones you hadn't fully respected. What he had not accounted for was the south fence line. Dutch found him in the barn at 6 and said it without preamble. South line is down, at least 3 sections. Cattle are drifting. Gideon absorbed this. Drifting cattle in this temperature and this wind would move with the storm, away from the ranch, and if they moved far enough and fast enough, finding them again would be a different kind of problem. The kind that involved losses that took years to recover from. Who's available, he said. Pete's down with something. Wallace and Tom are here. Get them up. We'll need... He stopped. He'd looked at the barn door and seen Ethan standing in it. The boy was already dressed for outside work. He had his coat on, his hat, his gloves. He looked at Gideon with the flat, ready look he got when there was something that needed doing. I heard, Ethan said. Gideon looked at him for a moment. The boy was 14 and not small for it, and Gideon had seen him work. He knew what Ethan's hands could do, knew the boy could read fence line, and knew how to move cattle, and didn't panic when the situation got difficult. All of that was true. It was also true that it was below zero and the wind was coming in at an angle that would steal your sense of direction if you weren't careful. Your mother know you're out here? Gideon said. I told her, Ethan said. She said to ask you. Which meant Clara had already made her assessment of the situation and handed it to him, which meant she trusted him with it, and he understood that this was not nothing. Stay close, Gideon said. You follow my line, not your own. When I stop, you stop. If we get separated, you come back to the barn. You don't push into the open, you come back. You understand that? Yes, Ethan said. Say it back. A slight pause. The brief resistance of a 14-year-old being asked to repeat instructions. And then, if we get separated, I come back to the barn. I don't push into the open. Good, Gideon said. Let's go. The storm hit them the moment they cleared the barn door, and it was considerably worse in the open than it had sounded from inside. The wind was not the howling kind. It was the low, relentless kind, the kind that pushed steadily and without drama, the kind that was more dangerous than the howling sort because it didn't tell you how bad it was getting. The snow was coming in at a slant and visibility was down to 40 or 50 feet. Gideon had made a rope line to the south fence earlier in the week, not because he'd anticipated this, but because he did it every year in November as a matter of practice. And he found it now with one hand and moved along it with Ethan close behind. Wallace and Tom had gone east with the same objective: find the break, find the cattle, bring them back. The ranch was big enough that splitting up made sense, but Gideon didn't love it in this weather. He filed it and kept moving. The first section of downed fence was where Dutch had said it would be, near the old cottonwood that marked the corner of the south pasture. 2 posts had gone over together, which meant the wire was slack across a gap of maybe 20 feet. Not cattle-proof. He could see the tracks in the snow where at least a portion of the herd had moved through. Ethan was already crouching next to the first post, testing it. "The ground froze around it wrong," he said. "It shifted and then the wire pulled the next one." "I know," Gideon said. He pulled a coil of wire from his bag. "We're not repairing it today. We're holding it." They spent 20 minutes doing a rough jury fix on the break. Not good work, not work he'd stand behind in better weather, but work that would hold long enough to matter today. Then they followed the tracks. The cattle had not gone far. 40 head, maybe 45, clustered in the low ground about 300 yards south of the broken line, using the contour of the land the way cattle always did, finding the place where the wind was least terrible and staying there. Getting them back was not complicated in theory. In practice, in this wind and this cold, it required patience and steadiness, and the willingness to move slower than instinct suggested. Gideon worked the left side. He put Ethan on the right. The boy was good. That was the thing. Gideon had suspected it, had seen evidence of it in smaller tasks, but watching him work the cattle in those conditions confirmed it in a way that was both satisfying and, for reasons Gideon couldn't immediately name, something more than that. Ethan moved the way good hands moved, reading the animal's hesitation before it became resistance, adjusting his angle, keeping his own movement slow and deliberate. He didn't rush. He made mistakes. Twice he pushed a little too hard, and the fringe of the herd started to scatter, and both times he caught it. But he caught it himself, adjusted himself, without looking to Gideon for direction. They got the herd back through the repaired gap in just over an hour. By the time they made it back to the barn, Gideon could no longer feel his left hand, the one he'd cut on the wire earlier in the week, and Ethan's face was red on both cheeks from the wind, and he was walking with the specific deliberateness of someone running on the last of their energy reserves. Inside the barn, out of the wind, the sudden absence of noise was almost disorienting. Gideon leaned against the stall and let his breathing settle. Beside him, Ethan pulled off his hat and sat down on a bale of hay and put his head back against the wall. Neither of them spoke for a while. "You did well out there," Gideon said. Ethan looked at the ceiling. "I pushed too hard twice." "I know. You fixed it both times." "I should have read it right the first time." Gideon looked at him. "Where did you learn to work cattle?" "I didn't," Ethan said. "Not really. I just watched what you did and did the same thing." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The wind was still going at the barn walls, but it was muffled now, reduced to pressure rather than sound. "Ethan," he said. The boy turned his head to look at him. "You can stop doing that," Gideon said. "Doing what?" "Accounting for every mistake before anyone else does. You don't have to get there first. Not here." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Something in the boy's face, not all of it, not suddenly, but a small portion of it, loosened, just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long that the first real relaxation of it was almost painful. "It's hard to stop," Ethan said. "I know," Gideon said. "I'm still working on it myself." They sat in the barn for another 10 minutes without talking. Then Ethan said, "My father would have come out in this." Gideon said nothing. "He wasn't good with cattle," Ethan continued, in the same tone he used when he was examining something honestly, without wanting anything from the examination. "He wasn't built for this kind of work, but he would have come out because he wouldn't have been able to stand the idea of you going without help." "Sounds like a man worth knowing," Gideon said. "He was," Ethan said. Then, after a pause, "I don't feel like I'm forgetting him. Being here. I thought I would, but I don't. Gideon did not say anything reassuring. He didn't tell the boy it was fine or that it made sense, or offer any of the soft words that people produced in these moments out of discomfort with the silence. He just let it be said and let it sit. Good, he said, finally. Ethan nodded. He put his hat back on and stood up. I should go see if my brothers are all right. Go, Gideon said. The boy went. Gideon stayed in the barn for a while longer, alone, with the sound of the storm on the walls and his left hand slowly coming back to pain as it warmed. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in, and the first thing she did was look at his hand, not at his face, not at the state of his coat. His hand, which she must have noticed, was wrapped around the door handle differently than usual. Sit down, she said. It's fine, he said. I didn't ask if it was fine, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She brought the basin and the clean cloth and sat across from him and unwrapped the makeshift bandage he'd put on it 4 days ago and hadn't changed since, which she plainly found inadequate without saying so. The cut had not gone badly. It was clean and was healing correctly. But it was deeper than he'd admitted, and the cold work had not helped it. She cleaned it without comment and without being gentle about it either, which he respected. He watched her work. Her hands were steady. She had been doing this kind of thing, managing injuries, managing the small physical emergencies of 4 boys in a world full of things to fall from and run into, for long enough that it was just a thing she did, without drama. Ethan came inside 20 minutes ago, she said. He's fine. I know he is. He was good out there. She glanced up briefly. I know. He told me. What did he say? He said you didn't second-guess him. He said you let him work. She wrapped the hand with clean cloth, tight but not restrictive. Do you know how long it's been since someone let him just work without watching him every minute? I'm guessing since his father died, Gideon said. Since before that? Clara said quietly. James was sick for almost a year before the influenza took him. Ethan was 13. He started carrying it then. She finished the bandage and sat back. He doesn't know how not to carry things. It's the only way he knows how to love people. Gideon looked at her. She was looking at his hand. Same could be said of you, he said. She met his eyes. I know, she said. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the storm was still running its course. From upstairs, he could hear Noah's voice rising in some complaint or narration, and then Caleb's lower voice answering, and then quiet. I've been thinking about the letter, Clara said. He didn't say anything. I've been thinking about Harold Fenn and what the agency says about him, and what the reasonable choice is. She folded the leftover cloth and set it on the table. And I've been thinking about what you said, about the difference between making something work and wanting it. Clara, let me finish, she said. Not harshly. I've spent 3 years making things work. After James died, I made things work in St. Louis for as long as I could, and when I couldn't anymore, I made the decision to come here because it seemed like the most available kind of making it work. And the agency said there was a rancher in Wyoming who needed a wife, and I thought, all right, I can be useful to someone, and maybe that's what I have left. She stopped. She looked at the table. And then you didn't send the telegram, she said. And you came to the station, and you didn't make us get back on the train, and you talked to Miles about his hands, and you let Ethan work, and you sat with Caleb about the cattle book, and you let Noah tell you the weather vane was stuck even though you already knew. She looked up. You didn't do any of those things because of an arrangement. You did them because you're not actually as closed off as you think you are. Gideon held her gaze. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm not going to Denver, she said. I'm saying that I've decided, and I'm telling you now because 17 days is too long to carry it. The wind hit the house hard from the north. The lamp on the table swayed slightly. That's your decision, he said. You're sure? I've been sure for a week, she said. I was waiting to see if I was sure about the reason. Now I am. He didn't ask her what the reason was. She didn't elaborate. There are things that 2 careful private people manage to say to each other without the specific words, and this was one of those things, and both of them understood it. I'll write to the agency in the morning, he said. I already wrote it, she said. It's on the sideboard. You just need to sign it. It was the second time she'd said exactly that to him, and this time he did smile, briefly, and not very wide, but genuinely. He signed the letter without reading it first. What neither of them had anticipated was Caleb. Not that he did something wrong, Caleb never did anything that could be straightforwardly called wrong. What Caleb did was notice things, and what he noticed that evening after the storm had gone to its second quieter phase, and supper was done, and the kitchen was settling into its nightly stillness, was that something had changed between his mother and Gideon. He sat at the table with his book open, and he watched them move around the kitchen with the alert, cataloging attention he brought to everything, and then he said without looking up, "You're staying." It was not a question. Caleb rarely asked questions. He always, she said. Caleb turned a page. "For how long?" "I don't know exactly," Clara said. "For the foreseeable time." Caleb absorbed this. He looked at Gideon. "Does that mean we live here now? Permanently?" Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at Gideon. This was a question neither of them had discussed in those precise terms, and both of them recognized that Caleb, 11 years old, reading a cattle management book at the kitchen table, had just arrived at the exact point they had been carefully navigating around. "That's the direction things are heading," Gideon said. Caleb looked at him for a moment with those precise, measuring eyes. "Are you going to marry my mother?" Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. "Caleb," she said. "It's a reasonable question," Caleb said, with the infuriating calm of someone who knows he's right. Gideon looked at the boy. He could deflect. He was good at deflecting. He'd been doing it for 3 years with everything that mattered. He could say that's a conversation for later, or we're taking things one day at a time, or any of the other true adjacent things adults said to children when they didn't want to answer. Instead, he said, "Yes, that's what I'm hoping." Caleb looked at his mother. Clara's expression did something complicated. The particular expression of a woman who has just had a decision announced publicly before she'd had a chance to state it herself, and who is not entirely displeased about it despite herself. "We'll discuss it like adults," she said, which was aimed at Gideon and contained a warning he deserved. "Of course," he said. Caleb turned another page. "I think that's the right decision," he said, with the decisive finality of someone closing an argument, and went back to reading. Chet. Noah found out the following morning. Not because anyone told him. Noah found things out the way water found level, through no particular effort, by simply occupying the space where information collected. He came downstairs while Clara and Gideon were both still at the kitchen table, earlier than usual, and he climbed into his chair and looked from one to the other with those enormous dark eyes and said, "Are we staying here forever?" "That's the plan," Clara said. Noah considered this with the thoroughness he brought to all significant information. Then he said, "Can I get a dog?" Gideon looked at him. "Where did that come from?" "Wallace has a dog," Noah said. "If we're staying, I want a dog." "Wallace's dog bites," Gideon said. Noah appeared to file this as a separate issue. "Can I get a dog that doesn't bite?" Clara pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was suppressing something. "We'll talk about it," she said. "That means no," Noah said, with the accuracy of a child who had been told, "We'll talk about it many times." "It means we'll talk about it," Gideon said, "which is not a no." Noah looked at him with an expression that was reassessing something. "Okay," he said. Then he reached for the bread on the table and began eating, apparently satisfied, while the morning came in through the window and the storm's residue glittered on the yard outside. Miles found out last, not because he was the least observant. He was, in his way, the most observant of all of them. But because he spent 2 days after the storm working with Gideon on the south fence repair, and they didn't talk about anything that wasn't fence-related, and by the time the fence was done, Miles had apparently already worked it out for himself. He came in for supper on the 3rd evening after the storm, sat down, ate half his meal, and then said, to no one in particular, "I fixed the weather vane." Everyone looked at him. "On the small barn," he said. "It's pointing the right way now. Noah's been asking about it for 2 weeks." Gideon looked at the boy. Miles met his eyes with that watchful, careful look, and there was something in it, not a smile, not anything so direct, but something that meant, "I'm fixing things here now. This is mine to fix." And Gideon understood that this was the way Miles was saying what Noah had said out loud, and Caleb had said with his questions, and Ethan had said in the barn during the storm. Each of them in their own language saying the same thing. He looked at Clara. She was looking at Miles with an expression he had learned to recognize in the past 3 weeks. The specific expression of a mother watching her child land somewhere soft after a long time of not knowing where the landing would be. "Good work," Gideon said to Miles. Miles picked up his fork. The left brace was loose, he said. I used the smaller nails. I didn't have the right size, but they held. Show me after supper, Gideon said. We'll do it right with the right hardware. Miles nodded. He ate his supper. Outside the kitchen window, the weather vane on the small barn was pointing true for the first time in 2 years, and the wind had gone to nothing, and the last of the storm's clouds were pulling east across the flat Wyoming sky. That evening, after supper, Gideon went upstairs and found the key to the locked room in his shirt pocket, where he'd been carrying it since he'd taken it off the shelf 3 weeks ago. He stood in the hallway. He looked at the door at the end of it. He stood there long enough that the lamp in his hand began to feel heavy. Then he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was cold and still, and it smelled like something old and closed, and everything in it was exactly as he had left it 2.5 years ago. The quilt on the bed that Margaret had never finished, the vanity mirror with the brass frame filmed with dust, the small stack of letters from her family in Ohio. He did not go through anything. He did not sort or organize or decide. He just stood in the room with the lamp and looked at what was there, and he let it be what it was. Not something that had to be erased or replaced or covered over, but something that had happened and mattered and was behind him now in the specific way that real things go behind you, fully, permanently, and still a part of the man who was standing at the window looking out at the dark yard where 4 boys were now asleep, and a woman had decided, of her own choosing, to stay. He left the door unlocked when he went back down the hall. It was a small thing. He was not sure Clara would even notice, but he thought she might because she noticed everything, and he thought when she did, she would understand what it meant without him having to say it, because she was exactly that kind of person. He went back to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table until it was late, and the house settled around him with the particular weight of a place that had people in it. Clara noticed the unlocked door on a Thursday morning. She had gone upstairs to bring clean linens to the boys' rooms, and she walked the length of the hall the way she always did. And when she reached the end of it, the door that had been locked every single day for the past month was standing slightly ajar, the latch not caught, a thin line of gray winter light visible at the edge. She did not open it. She stood in the hallway and looked at it for a moment, and then she went and put the linens in the boys' rooms and came back downstairs. And she did not say anything about it at breakfast or at dinner or in the evening when Gideon came in from the barn. But something shifted in the way she looked at him across the kitchen table that night. Just briefly, just once, and he saw it and looked away, and neither of them mentioned it, which was its own kind of conversation. The agency's confirmation letter arrived 2 days after that. Mr. Raymond Holt wrote to acknowledge receipt of their decision and to wish both parties well in their arrangement going forward. He also enclosed, with what Gideon suspected was professional delicacy, a brief note indicating that Mr. Harold Fenn of Denver had been informed of Mrs. Whitmore's decision and had taken the news with understanding. The matter was, as far as the agency was concerned, closed. Gideon put that letter in the stove. There was no ceremony to it. He just opened the firebox and put it in and went back to his coffee, and Clara watched him do it from across the kitchen and said nothing, and that was that. What came next was not a honeymoon period. There was no period of uncomplicated ease where everything resolved itself into warmth and forward motion. What came next was January, which in Wyoming was not interested in anyone's domestic arrangements and had its own set of demands entirely. The cattle needed tending in temperatures that made the work genuinely dangerous. The supply wagon from Cheyenne was 2 days late because of road conditions, which meant 3 days of rationing the lamp oil and being creative about meals. The East Barn's roof developed a leak that let in wind and moisture in a way that wasn't immediately catastrophic but would be if ignored. And Gideon spent a day and a half on that roof in conditions that Dutch described as inadvisable and that Gideon described as necessary, which was the same argument they'd been having for 7 years. Clara managed the household through all of it with the same practical steadiness she'd shown since the first week, but January revealed new textures of it that Gideon hadn't seen yet. He saw how she handled scarcity, not with panic and not with false reassurance, but with a kind of inventive calm that produced meals from nearly nothing and kept the boys from understanding how close to the edge the supply situation had gotten. He saw how she made decisions under pressure. When Noah developed a cough in the second week of January that was bad enough to worry about, she was the one who assessed it, made the call that it was not yet serious enough to risk the 11-mile trip to town in the cold, and managed it herself with steam and rest and a specific tea she made from dried herbs she'd brought from St. Louis in her bag. The cough was gone in 5 days. He watched all of this and said little about it, because saying much about it felt like commenting on something that was simply the way she was, and commenting on the way someone fundamentally was tended to make them self-conscious about it. But one evening, near the end of January, he told her, "You're good at this." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "At what?" "All of it," he said. "The whole thing. Managing the house, the boys, the supply problems, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've had a lot of practice managing with not enough." "That's not the same as being good at it," he said. "Plenty of people practice something for years and stay bad at it." She turned from the stove and looked at him with an expression he still found difficult to read entirely. There were layers in how she looked at him that he suspected he was only getting to part way. "Are you trying to pay me a compliment, Gideon?" "I'm stating a fact," he said. "All right," she said. She turned back to the stove. "Thank you." It was not a gracious acceptance. It was not particularly warm, but it was real, and he'd learned by now that real was what she gave you when she gave you anything, and he'd take real over gracious every time. The conversation about the wedding happened on a Sunday afternoon in the last week of January, which was not the romantic occasion that word suggested. They were both at the kitchen table with the household accounts between them. She'd been managing the books for 3 weeks now, and had found 2 additional billing errors with the Cheyenne merchant, and had reorganized the whole ledger system in a way that was considerably clearer than his had been. And they were going through the supply projections for February. When Clara set down her pencil and said, "We should talk about the practical arrangements," Gideon looked at her. "Which ones?" "A legal marriage," she said. "What it would require, what it would mean for the boys." She picked up the pencil again and set it down again. "I've been thinking about it since Caleb asked you directly, and I think I've been using the word arrangement as a way to avoid pinning down what we're actually talking about." "And what are we actually talking about?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I'm talking about whether you want to marry me. Formally. Legally. Not because the agency set it up and not because the winter made it convenient, but because it's what you want to do." He looked at the ledger between them. He looked at the pencil she'd set down. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's what I want." "I want to be clear about what that means," she said. "It means 4 boys. It means their noise and their needs and their problems. It means Ethan's stubbornness and Miles's silences and Caleb's questions at inconvenient moments and Noah asking for a dog approximately once every 3 days." "I'm aware of what it means," he said. "I'm not sure you are entirely," she said. Not unkindly. "You've had a month with them. A month in winter when they're cooped up and on their best behavior because they're still figuring out the rules of the place. Summer is different. When they have room to run and room to make real mistakes and room to get into real trouble, it's different." "Clara," he said, "I'm just telling you what you're agreeing to." "I know what I'm agreeing to," he said. "I knew what I was agreeing to when I let Ethan come out in that storm with me. I knew it when I sat with Miles about his hands. I've known it for a while, and I haven't looked away from it." He paused. "Have you?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Then let's stop finding reasons to wait," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the particular decisiveness she applied to things she'd already decided and was just now confirming. "The judge comes through Cheyenne on the 2nd Friday of February," she said. "I know." "That's 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "Is that enough time?" "I don't need time," she said. "I need a clean dress and a witness." "Dutch can be the witness," Gideon said. "Dutch will cry," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Dutch doesn't cry." "Dutch absolutely cries," she said. "He cried when Noah fixed him that drawing of the barn." Gideon opened his mouth and closed it. He had no counter to that, in part because now that she said it, he could entirely picture it. "He can still be the witness," he said. For the first time in his memory, real laughter, not the near smile she produced in moments of dry amusement. Clara laughed. It was brief and genuine, and it changed the whole character of the room for the 3 seconds it lasted. And then she picked up her pencil and looked back at the ledger and said, "All right, Dutch can be the witness." Telling the boys was Ethan's idea. Not in the way that Ethan made suggestions, directly, with rationale attached. He came to Gideon in the barn 2 days after the kitchen conversation, and he said, "You should tell them together, not one by one. Together, at supper, so it's not a secret that some of them have and some of them don't." Gideon looked at him. "Your mother tell you to say that?" "No," Ethan said. "But she'd agree with it." He was right on both counts. That evening, Gideon and Clara told the 4 boys at the supper table together, while the lamp was lit and the kitchen was warm and there was still food on the table, because that was when people were most likely to receive news with equanimity. Noah reacted first, which was always the way. He looked at his mother and then at Gideon and then back at his mother, and he said, "Does that mean he's our father now?" The table went very quiet. Clara looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Noah. "It means I'm your stepfather," he said carefully. "That's a specific thing. It's not the same as your father, who was your father and always will be. But it means I'm here, permanently, in whatever way that means something to you." Noah thought about this with visible effort. Then he said, "Can I get a dog now?" Miles made a sound that was almost a laugh. Caleb looked at the table with an expression that was doing too many things at once to identify. Ethan looked at Gideon with the measuring look he always used, and Gideon held it, and eventually Ethan looked down at his plate and said, quietly, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." But the way he said it, not resigned, not reluctant, but settled, like a load put down after a long carry, made Gideon's chest do something he didn't have immediate words for. Caleb was the one who asked the hard question, because Caleb was always the one who asked the hard question. "What happens to us if something happens to you?" he said, looking at Gideon. 11 years old, with the steady eyes of someone who had learned to look directly at difficult things. "Caleb," Clara said. "It's all right," Gideon said. He looked at the boy. "If something happened to me, the ranch would go to your mother. I'll have that written down legally. You'd be provided for." Caleb considered this. "And if something happened to both of you?" "Caleb," Clara said again, with more weight. "Dutch Keller has agreed to be named guardian," Gideon said, which was not actually something he'd discussed with Dutch yet, but which he was now entirely committed to in any legal documents I have drawn up. Caleb absorbed this. He nodded. He picked up his fork. "All right," he said. "That makes sense." Gideon looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Caleb with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and a love so plainly visible it could have powered the lamp. The marriage took place on the second Friday of February, exactly as Clara had said. The judge's name was Harlan Poole, a thin man in his 60s who had been performing civil marriages and recording land disputes in Wyoming for 20 years, and who had the brisk, efficient energy of a man who respected his schedule. The ceremony took place in the judge's temporary office in the Cheyenne courthouse, which smelled like wood smoke and old paper. Dutch was the witness. He did not cry during the ceremony. He cried afterward, briefly, facing a wall in the hallway while pretending to look for something in his coat, and Gideon did not mention it then or afterward. Clara wore a dark blue dress that was the best thing she owned and that she had pressed carefully the night before. Gideon wore his good coat. The boys sat in a row on the wooden bench along the wall, Noah between Miles and Ethan, Caleb on the end, and they were, for approximately 8 consecutive minutes, the quietest Gideon had ever seen them. When Judge Poole asked if there were any objections, Noah raised his hand. Everyone looked at him. "I don't have an objection," Noah said seriously. "I just want to say that I think this is a good idea." Judge Poole looked at the 4-year-old for a moment. "Noted," he said, and continued. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Noah with her eyes bright in a way that she would not later describe as crying. He reached over and took her hand, which he had not planned to do, and she let him, which he had not been certain of. They signed the documents. Judge Poole shook their hands. Dutch shook their hands. Ethan shook Gideon's hand with the particular formality of a 14-year-old who understood that some moments required formal acknowledgement, and Gideon shook it back with the same seriousness. They had lunch at the only restaurant in Cheyenne that was open on a Friday in February, which was not a fancy establishment, and the food was adequate rather than good, and Noah spilled his milk and Caleb read the menu with analytical interest, and Miles sat next to Gideon without being asked, and Ethan ate in the deliberate way he did everything, and it was all imperfect and unremarkable and entirely real. What changed after the wedding was not the large things. The large things had already changed, or were already changing, in the slow, accumulative way of real change. What changed was the smaller things, the texture of daily life, the specific weight of ordinary moments. Gideon noticed it first in how he came inside in the evenings. For 3 years, coming inside had been the act of ending the day's work and beginning the night's endurance. The shift from cold to warmth had felt like nothing more than a physical change in temperature. Now it was something else. Not a dramatic something, not a romantic something, but the specific something of walking into a space that was occupied by people who registered your arrival. Noah, if he was still up, would note his presence. Miles would look up from whatever he was examining. Caleb might ask a question that had been waiting all day. Ethan would give him the brief nod that was Ethan's version of a welcome. And Clara would not necessarily look up immediately. She might be finishing something at the stove or at the table, and she'd finish it, and then she'd look up, and there was something in how she did that, the unrushed, unperformed naturalness of it, that was more than all the dramatic warmth he'd feared the arrangement might require him to perform. She was not easy to live with, and he didn't want her to be. She was precise about the things that mattered to her, and impatient with inefficiency and occasionally sharp-tongued in the mornings before her coffee. And she had opinions about the supply order and the fence maintenance schedule and the way the ranch hands were managed that she expressed directly and expected to be taken seriously. And she was usually right, which was its own kind of challenge. I was not easy to live with either. He knew this. He was too quiet for too long sometimes, and when things went wrong, when a calf was lost in a late February cold snap, when a payment from the cattle broker came in short, he went inward in a way that was probably hard to be around and that he didn't entirely know how to change. He forgot things he'd said he'd do. He was stubborn about his own methods past the point of reason on 2 separate occasions in February, and both times Clara told him so with a directness he couldn't fault even as it irritated him. These were not the signs of a failing arrangement. They were the signs of 2 actual people living in actual proximity, and both of them understood the difference. Dutch watched all of it with the expression of a man who had been right about something significant and was choosing, with visible effort, not to say so too often. Ethan came to Gideon in the 3rd week of February with a question he'd been working up to for a while. Gideon could tell it had been waiting. There was a specific quality to the boy when he was carrying something he hadn't said yet, a slight additional stillness, a way of showing up in the same space a few times without quite beginning. They were in the barn. Gideon was checking the horses and Ethan was beside him, handing him things when they were needed. And after about 20 minutes of this, Ethan said, "Can I ask you something about the ranch?" "Yes," Gideon said. "The south pasture," Ethan said. "The one that floods in spring along the creek line. I was looking at the drainage there, and I think if you moved the fence 20 feet east, the runoff would go toward the lower ground instead of backing up into the pasture. You'd lose a little grazing space, but you'd keep the ground solid for the cattle through April." Gideon kept working for a moment. Then he stopped and looked at the boy. "When did you figure this out?" "I've been looking at it since December," Ethan said. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure." Gideon thought about the south pasture and the specific drainage problem that had cost him 2 weeks of usable grazing every spring for the past 4 years. He thought about the boy who had spent 2 months quietly observing a problem and working out a solution before he spoke, because he didn't want to be wrong. "You're right," he said. "That would work." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if it was my place to say." "It's your place," Gideon said. "This is your home. The problems here are yours to solve if you see a solution." He paused. "You understand that? Not because I'm telling you, because it's true." Ethan looked at him with those careful, testing eyes. Something in them, that permanent low-level watchfulness, that braced quality, eased just slightly, the way ice eased in the first days of a thaw, not gone, but beginning. "We'll move the fence in March," Gideon said. "You and me. I'll want your eye on the line placement." Ethan nodded. He picked up the next thing Gideon needed and handed it over, and they worked the rest of the afternoon in the specific, comfortable quiet of 2 people who had arrived, without announcing it, at a new kind of ease with each other. Clara found the unfinished quilt on a Saturday afternoon at the end of February. She had finally gone into the room at the end of the hall, the door that Gideon had left unlocked, not to sort through it, not to claim it, but because the room was cold and she wanted to know if the window was sealing properly in the frame, which it wasn't, and which she was going to have Gideon look at before another cold snap arrived. She fixed the window latch herself with a piece of folded cloth wedged into the frame, the way you did when you didn't have the right hardware immediately available and needed to make do. And then she saw the quilt folded on the chair by the vanity. She recognized what it was immediately. The unfinished kind, the kind that had been put down mid-work. The pattern was a simple one, alternating squares, blues, and creams, but careful and even and clearly made by someone who knew what they were doing. About 2/3 completed. The remaining squares were cut and stacked neatly beside it, ready to be sewn. She stood there for a while. She picked up one of the unfinished squares and looked at the needlework on the completed portion. Margaret Voss had been careful and good at this. The seams were tight and even, the corners precise. Clara set the square back on the stack. She looked around the room. The mirror, the letters, the plain furniture, all of it held in the particular stillness of a space that had been stopped. Not neglected. Stopped. There was a difference. She went back downstairs and found Gideon in the main room, mending a piece of tack he'd brought inside because the temperature in the barn made the leather too stiff. "The window in that room doesn't seal," she said. "I wedged the latch, but you need to look at it properly before March." He looked up. He knew which room she meant. "All right," he said. She sat down across from him. She picked up her own mending from the basket by the chair. Noah had torn the knee of his second-best trousers, again, and she worked for a moment before she said, without looking up, she was good at the quilt work. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "The pattern she was using. I can finish it if you want. It would be a usable thing. The boys could use another blanket." He looked at her. She was looking at her mending. "That doesn't bother you?" he said. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. "It might bother me a little," she said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm not going to pretend she didn't exist either, and leaving that quilt unfinished forever seems like a waste of good work." She looked up. "Is it something you'd want?" He thought about it. About the room, the quilt, what it meant to have it finished, and what it meant to have it stay the way it was. He thought about what Clara had just done. Not turned the room over, not made it into something different, not pretended around it. Just opened it and fixed the window latch and offered to finish something that had been stopped. "Yes," he said. "I think I'd want that." She nodded and went back to Noah's trousers. They sat in the main room in the late afternoon, both of them with their hands occupied, and the fire in the hearth was low and steady, and from upstairs they could hear the particular sounds of the boys. Miles hammering something small that he was building in the room he'd taken over. Caleb's voice reading something aloud to Noah, who had asked to be read to and then almost certainly fallen asleep halfway through. Gideon looked at his wife, which was still a word he turned over in his mind sometimes to test how it fit, and found each time that it fit better than the time before. And she was bent over her work with the focused attention she brought to everything, and she was not beautiful in the way that word usually got used, which was a word about smoothness and ease. She was something else, something that required more complicated language than beautiful. She was real in a way that made the room around her feel more real. He looked back at his work. From outside, the last of the February light was going flat and gray against the windows, and the cold was settling in for another night the way it always did this time of year in Wyoming. Thoroughly, without apology, and with every intention of still being there in the morning. But the stove in the kitchen was banked for the night, and there was enough wood stacked for 2 days, and the boys were upstairs making the sounds of children who were safe and warm, and his wife was across from him with a needle in her hand. March was 11 days away. He thought about what Ethan had said about the south pasture, about moving the fence line east and letting the runoff go where it wanted to go instead of fighting it into the wrong channels. He thought about how much of the past 3 years had been him fighting the natural direction of things. The loneliness, the cold, the particular grief of a man who had locked a door and put the key on the wrong shelf and called it coping. He thought about Caleb's question at the supper table. What happens to us if something happens to you? And the answer he'd given, which was the truth, but also something more than the truth. It was a commitment, spoken aloud, at a supper table, to 4 boys who had been asking some version of that question since their father died. He was not their father. He had not tried to be. He was something else, something without a clean name for it, something that was still being defined by the daily fact of showing up and being present and letting the work they did together accumulate into something that would eventually be too solid to call anything other than a family. He was not going to be good at all of it. He already knew this. He would be too remote sometimes, too stubborn others, too slow to say the right thing at the right moment. He would make mistakes with them. Not the serious kind, but the ordinary kind, the kind that required repair and apology and the continued willingness to try. He thought he could do that. He thought, for the first time in 3 years, with something that felt like actual confidence rather than grim resolve, that he could do that. Outside, the wind came up briefly and then settled, and the house took it without complaint, the way the house always did, the way things built to last absorbed what came at them and stayed standing on the other side of it. Across from him, Clara finished Noah's trousers and folded them and reached into the mending basket for the next thing, and her wedding ring, a plain band, her choice, nothing ornate, caught the firelight briefly as she moved, and Gideon watched this and said nothing and felt, in the specific quiet of a Wyoming evening in the last days of winter, that the house he had been maintaining alone for 3 years had become, without a single dramatic announcement, the home he had not known he was building toward. He went back to the tack in his hands. The fire held. March came in the way it always did in Wyoming, not gently, not with any of the tentative warmth that the word spring suggested to people who had never wintered on the high plains. It came in sideways with 2 more hard freezes and a week of wind that scoured the topsoil off the exposed ridgelines and piled it against the fence posts in long gray drifts. The cattle were restless with it. The horses were difficult. Noah developed another cough, shorter this time, gone in 3 days. And Gideon found himself checking on the boy twice in the night without entirely understanding when that had become something he did. But the light was changing. That was the first real sign, the one you could trust before any of the others. The afternoons were running longer by increments that were small enough to doubt on any individual day, but unmistakable across a week, and the particular quality of the late-day sun, lower and flatter in winter, arriving sideways and leaving early, had begun its slow climb towards something more direct. Gideon had been reading that light for 15 years, and he knew what it meant. The ground was still frozen. The mud season hadn't come yet, which meant the truly hard work hadn't come yet either, but it was on its way. He and Ethan moved the south pasture fence line in the first week of March, on one of the 3 days that week when the wind dropped enough to make outdoor work something other than punishment. It took the better part of 2 days. The ground was still reluctant, and resetting posts in frozen soil required patience and a specific technique that Ethan learned quickly, and then applied with the methodical thoroughness that was his way of doing everything. They moved the line 22 feet east, slightly more than Ethan's original estimate, because once Gideon walked the full length of it with fresh eyes, he could see that the boy had been conservative. 22 feet was right. On the second afternoon, with the last post set and the wire strung, they stood back and looked at what they'd done. The line ran true. The lower ground to the east would take the runoff now, carry it away from the pasture, and the cattle would have solid footing through April for the first time in years. "You were right about this," Gideon said. Ethan looked at the fence. "I wasn't sure until we got into it." "That's how it usually is," Gideon said. "You can only be so sure from a distance. The rest you figure out when you're actually in it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at the line they'd laid. Then he said, "I want to learn the books." Gideon looked at him. "The ranch accounts?" "My mother does them now, I know that. But I want to understand how they work. How you know when the ranch is sound and when it isn't. How you plan for the things you can't see coming." He paused. "I want to know how this place actually runs." Gideon was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to answer it correctly. This was Ethan telling him something important about what he was thinking about his own future, about whether he saw himself in this place long enough to learn its deepest mechanics. A boy who was planning to leave didn't ask to learn the books. "We'll start in April," Gideon said, "once the mud season is through and the pace settles." Ethan nodded. He picked up the tools and began carrying them back toward the barn, and Gideon watched him go. This boy who had arrived on a frozen platform carrying 2 bags and watching everything with flat, assessing eyes, and thought about what 4 months could do to a person when the conditions were right, which was not to say easy. Conditions being right and conditions being easy were not the same thing, and Ethan had taught him that more clearly than anyone. Clara finished Margaret's quilt in the second week of March. She had worked on it in the evenings, in the main room, with the particular focused quietness she brought to things she was doing by choice rather than necessity. Gideon had watched her work on it across several evenings without commenting, and she hadn't offered explanation, and this was one of the ways they had learned to live with each other. The understanding that some things didn't require narration. When it was done, she folded it and brought it to the kitchen table and set it in front of him one morning before breakfast while the boys were still upstairs. He looked at it. The completed squares were indistinguishable from the original ones. She had matched the tension of the needlework, the weight of the seams. If you didn't know where it had been stopped, you couldn't find the line. "I couldn't match the exact thread on two of the squares," she said. "Slightly different shade of blue. You can see it in good light." He looked at the quilt. He found the two squares she meant. The difference was slight. Not wrong, not jarring, just different, the way a repair always carried its own small signature. "It's good," he said. "It's not perfect," she said. "No," he said. "It's better than that." She looked at him with the expression she used when he said something she hadn't expected. Then she picked up the quilt and put it in the chest at the foot of the bed in the boys' room, where it would be used, which was what she'd said she intended, and that was that. But that evening, when the house was quiet and the boys were in bed and Gideon was banking the kitchen stove for the night, Clara was still at the table, and she said, to the middle distance rather than to him, "I think I was afraid of her." He stopped what he was doing. "Margaret?" "The idea of her," Clara said. "What she meant to you. What you'd built here with her. I thought—" She paused, and he could hear her choosing the words carefully, not the polished kind of careful, but the honest kind. "I thought if I stayed, I'd always be living in the space someone else had made, and that maybe that's not a real life, just an occupation of someone else's." He sat down across from her. "And now?" "Now I think that's not how it works," she said. "The space someone made isn't the same as the life you make in it. James made a life with me in a house we didn't build. That was still our life." She looked at him. "This is still ours, even with all the things that were here before us." He thought about the unlocked door, about the quilt, about the key he'd carried in his pocket for weeks before he could use it. "I should have opened that room sooner," he said. "You opened it when you were ready," she said. "That's not a failure." It felt like one for a while. "Most necessary things do," she said, "before you do them." He looked at his wife across the kitchen table, in the house he'd been maintaining alone for 3 years, and thought that just the two of them talking plainly at a kitchen table at the end of a long day, was the thing he had missed most acutely and most silently in all that time. Not companionship in the abstract, this specific thing, another person who said the true thing without performing it. Spring arrived in earnest in the first week of April, which in Wyoming meant mud first and warmth second, and the particular chaos of a working ranch coming out of its winter contraction all at once. The cattle needed moving. The calving season had started and required constant attention. The south pasture fence, their fence, his and Ethan's, held through the first real thaw, exactly as planned, and the drainage ran east the way it was supposed to, and the pasture floor stayed solid, and Gideon did not say anything about this to Ethan because he didn't need to. The boy walked the fence line himself one morning and came back to the barn and said nothing, but he stood a little differently after that, the way a person stands when something they believed has been proven right by the actual world. Miles built a cold frame for Clara's kitchen garden in the second week of April. This was not assigned or requested. It was Miles doing what Miles did, seeing a problem and addressing it quietly and without announcement. Clara had mentioned once, in passing, that she wanted to start seeds earlier than the Wyoming ground would allow, and Miles had apparently filed this and gone away and thought about it, and then built a simple wood and glass frame against the south wall of the house that would give her 3 additional weeks of growing season. He showed it to her one morning and explained how it worked with the same technical directness he used for everything, and Clara stood looking at it for a long moment and then said, "Miles, this is exactly right." And Miles looked at the cold frame with satisfaction and said, "The angle could be better, but it'll do." It was, Gideon thought, the most Miles thing that had ever happened. Clara planted her garden in the last week of April. She had ordered seeds from a catalog in February, something Gideon had not previously thought to do, and which seemed obvious in retrospect. And she had a plan for the kitchen beds and the cold frame, and a longer-term plan for a proper vegetable garden that would require clearing some ground to the east of the house. She enlisted Caleb for the planning portion of this, which was correct, because Caleb had by April accumulated a working knowledge of Wyoming soil chemistry and drainage patterns that was for an 11-year-old genuinely impressive. You should rotate the heavy feeders, Caleb told her, with the authority of someone who had read about this extensively. Tomatoes and squash in year 1 on the east bed, then move them, otherwise you exhaust the soil. I know about crop rotation, Caleb, Clara said. I know you do, Caleb said, but you didn't specify it in the plan. Clara looked at him. You're going to be a tremendous nuisance when you're grown, she said. Caleb considered this. Probably, he said, and went back to his diagram. Noah got his dog in April. This was not a decision made suddenly or without negotiation. It was the result of 6 weeks of Noah asking about the dog at regular intervals. Not constantly, not in the wearing way of a child who didn't know when to stop, but strategically, choosing moments when Gideon was in a reasonable mood, and the answer was most likely to be something other than not yet. When Gideon finally said yes, Noah received the news with the solemnity of someone who understood that the right answer had required patience, and then immediately ran to tell Wallace, who had apparently been an ally in the campaign from the beginning. The dog was a 3-month-old shepherd mix from a ranch 20 miles north, gray and white, too big for what his feet suggested he'd eventually become, with the boundless, slightly unfocused energy of a puppy that had not yet developed any philosophy about conservation of effort. Noah named him December, which no one could talk him out of. The name made no sense in April, which Noah acknowledged and did not find relevant. December, the dog attached himself to Noah with the specific loyalty of a young animal that has identified its person, and followed him everywhere with a devotion that was both touching and logistically complex, particularly in the kitchen, where Clara enforced a policy that the dog observed approximately 60% of the time. Watching Noah with the dog in those first weeks, the boy's uncomplicated joy in it, the way he talked to December in a running low murmur as they moved through the yard together. Gideon thought about what Clara had said months ago, in that first terrible week, about Noah sleeping peacefully, that he had not been sleeping well, that the previous 2 years had taken something from the boy that sleep restored only partially. Looking at Noah now, running across the yard with the dog at his heels and his voice carrying back across the spring air in strings of happy noise, Gideon thought that this, specifically this, was what safety looked like from the outside. Not absence of difficulty. Presence of room. Room to run, room to be loud, room to care about a dog without that caring costing anything. He was glad he hadn't sent them back to the train. He thought about this sometimes, in the quiet moments, what the life he had been living would have continued to be if he had sent the telegram. The ranch would have been fine. The cattle, the accounts, the fence lines. All of it would have continued in its functional, adequately managed way. He would have survived another winter, and another after that, and the house would have remained exactly what it was, a place where someone lived without being entirely present in it. Survival was not a small thing. He did not want to suggest it was. There had been real months in that 3 years of widowhood where getting through the day had been the entirety of what was available to him, and he did not look back on that as weakness. You survived what you had to survive, and that was real work, and it mattered. But there was a difference. He understood it now in the specific, grounded way of someone who had moved from one to the other and could feel the distance between them. You could survive alone. He had done it. He knew it was possible because he had done it, long enough to know all its particular shapes and textures and the way it settled into you until you stopped noticing it was settling. But surviving alone was not the same as living. And the difference, he had found, was not about romance or sentiment or any of the large dramatic categories. It was about whether the work you did each day built toward something or just maintained against loss. It was about whether you came inside at the end of the day to a place or to a home. It was about whether, when something went right, the fence line holding, the drainage running true, a boy standing a little taller, there was someone to tell. There was someone to tell now. That was what it came down to, plain and unglamorous as that. Dutch found Gideon in the barn in the second week of May. The last time he did the specific thing of finding Gideon in the barn to say something he'd been waiting to say, because after this, things were different enough that he didn't need to wait for barn privacy anymore. I want to ask you something, Dutch said. Ask it, Gideon said. When that second letter came from the agency, with the deadline, Dutch leaned on the stall the same way he always did. Did you know then? What you were going to do? Gideon thought about it honestly. I knew what I wanted, he said. I wasn't sure I was going to get it. But you didn't push her. It wasn't mine to push. Dutch was quiet for a moment. Most men would have, he said. Most men would have made it harder for her to leave. You made it easier, told her about the letter right away, told her it was her decision. It was her decision, Gideon said. I know, Dutch said. That's what I'm saying. He pushed off the stall. You know what she told me? Last week, when we were looking at the east fence repair, she said she'd never had anyone make space for her to choose before. Not her parents, not even James, who was a good man by her account. Everyone always had the right answer ready for her. He paused. She said you were the first person who told her the true situation and then got out of the way. Gideon said nothing. I thought you should know that, Dutch said, and walked out. He stood in the barn for a while after that, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting it sit. He was not a man who processed things quickly or wore his realizations on the surface. But he understood what Dutch had given him, which was the thing that was hardest to know about yourself. Whether the choices you made out of what felt like respect were understood as respect by the person they affected. He had not known. He had done the only thing that seemed right and had not known if it had landed correctly. It had. That was enough. The quilt ended up on Noah and Miles's bed, which was where Clara put it when she decided it was time for it to be used rather than stored. Noah immediately claimed it as specifically his, which Miles tolerated with the patient resignation of a younger sibling who picked his battles. December the dog slept on it twice before being relocated, with some firmness, to the floor. The room at the end of the hall was no longer locked, and it was no longer empty. Clara had made a practical decision about it in March, which was that the house needed a room where the boys could do schoolwork, and where Caleb could keep his books without them migrating through the whole house, and the room at the end of the hall was the right size for it. She had said this to Gideon in the same practical tone she used for everything, and he had said yes, and together they had moved the things that had been Margaret's, the vanity, the remaining personal items, not out of the house, but into the storage space above the smaller barn, carefully, with no drama. The letters from Margaret's family in Ohio, Gideon kept in his own chest. That was his to keep. The room became what Clara intended. Caleb took to it with the enthusiasm of a person who had been living without enough flat surfaces for his books and papers, and within 2 weeks it had the particular organized chaos of a space that was actually being used rather than maintained. Miles used the workbench Clara had Dutch install under the east window to repair small things. The household's ongoing supply of small broken objects, which was considerable. Noah used the room primarily as a place to hide from responsibilities, a purpose it served adequately. Ethan used it in the evenings, after supper, to go through the ranch ledgers with Gideon. They had started in April, as agreed, and they worked through it the way they worked through everything, steadily, without rushing, Ethan asking questions that were increasingly less basic as the weeks went on. By May, he was catching things in the accounts that Gideon had to look at twice to confirm. By June, Gideon was letting him run the monthly reconciliation with only a final review. You could do this without me, Gideon told him one evening in June, looking at a reconciliation Ethan had completed cleanly and correctly. Not yet, Ethan said, which was also correct, but less correct than it had been in April. Give it a year, Gideon said. Ethan looked at the ledger. Then he said, without particular emphasis, I want to be here in a year. I know, Gideon said. I want to be here. Not because I have to be, because I want to be. Gideon set down his pencil and looked at the boy who was no longer entirely a boy, who was, in fact, becoming something that didn't have a clean category yet. Something between the 14-year-old who had arrived on a frozen platform, watching everything with flat defensive eyes, and whatever he was going to be at 20, at 30. He was in the passage between those things, which was the most precarious place a person could be, and he was moving through it with more steadiness than Gideon had managed at the same age. I know, Gideon said again. I want you here. Ethan looked at the ledger. He nodded, once, in the way that meant the thing was settled, and went back to the numbers, and Gideon went back to his, and the room held them both in the light of the lamp until it was late enough that they both admitted to being tired and went to bed. The summer was hard in the specific ways that Wyoming summers were hard. Too hot in July, dry through August in a way that worried Gideon about the fall grazing. A fence line problem on the north edge in late August that took a week to find and fix. Clara's garden produced well through July and fell off in August with the heat, and she adapted to this with the same practicality she adapted to everything, harvesting what was ready and letting go of what wasn't going to make it. Noah in December, the dog covered approximately 40 miles a day, by rough estimate, in the course of their daily operations. Miles built 3 things and quietly dismantled one of them because it was wrong, and rebuilt it correctly without mentioning the first attempt. Caleb, in August, found a book in the Cheyenne merchant's shop, A Natural History of the Wyoming Basin, poorly organized but comprehensive, and read it in 4 days and came home with more questions about soil alkalinity and grass species than Gideon had been asked in the previous decade combined. Gideon answered what he could and admitted what he couldn't, and wrote a letter on Caleb's behalf to a land agent in Cheyenne who had a background in range management and who agreed, with some bemusement, to correspond with the 12-year-old who had questions about grass. These were ordinary things. Not one of them was dramatic. Not one of them was the kind of moment that got remembered as a turning point, because turning points were mostly something you identified in retrospect, after enough ordinary things had accumulated to make the turn unmistakable. But there was one evening in August that Gideon did remember. It was a Tuesday, late in the month, when the heat of the day had finally broken and there was a breeze coming in off the grassland that was the first suggestion of the fall that was still 6 weeks away. Clara had moved supper outside. Not a common thing, but something she did occasionally when the kitchen was too warm and the evening was willing. And they had eaten at the rough table Dutch had built from old fence boards and set up in the yard, all 6 of them, and Dutch as well. And the meal had been what it usually was, which was not elegant but was real food, and the conversation had been what it usually was, which was everything and nothing in particular. Afterward, when the boys had drifted, Noah in December toward the barn, Miles toward the thing he was building, Caleb to his book, Ethan to the horses. And Dutch had gone back to the bunkhouse with the specific courtesy of a man who knew when to leave people their own evening. Gideon and Clara sat at the outdoor table while the last of the light went out of the sky. She had her coffee. He had his. The grassland out beyond the fence was going gray gold in the dusk, and the windmill near the east well was turning slowly, and from somewhere near the barn he could hear Noah's voice narrating something to December, who was presumably listening. "Are you happy?" Clara asked. He looked at her. She was looking at the grassland. It was a simple question, and it was also not a simple question, and they both knew this. It was the kind of question that required a real answer rather than the reflexive kind, and she had asked it directly because that was who she was. He thought about it honestly. Not happiness in the uncomplicated sense. He was not an uncomplicated man in an uncomplicated life, and the feeling he carried most days was not precisely happiness, but something more durable and more mixed than that. He thought about the mornings that were still hard, the ones where grief arrived sideways, and he handled it with silence that Clara no longer tried to break open. He thought about the arguments they'd had in 6 months of marriage, not many but real, about the supply decisions, and once, badly, about how he'd spoken to Ethan during a tense week in June and how that one had required the hardest conversation he'd had in years. He thought about the ways he was still too quiet, still too slow with the right words, still learning the rhythms of being someone other people depended on for something more than cattle management. And he thought about the fence line in the south pasture, running true, about the quilt on Noah's bed, finished, used, imperfect, about the unlocked door at the end of the hall, and what was in it now instead of grief. About a 14-year-old boy, 15 now, as of May, who had arrived watching every gap and had slowly, gradually, let someone else watch a few of them. "Yes," he said. "I think so." Clara looked at him. "You think so?" "I'm not good at certainty," he said. "You know that." She considered this. "That's fair," she said. Then, "I am happy. I want you to know that. Not because everything is easy, because it's real." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I don't know if I've said it plainly before." "You've said it in other ways," he said. "You say things in other ways." She almost smiled. "So do you," she said. They sat in the evening for a while after that without talking, which was something they had gotten good at. The specific shared quiet of two people who had said what needed saying and were comfortable with what came after. The stars were coming out over the grassland, the particular thick stars of a Wyoming August, and the windmill kept turning, and from the barn Noah's voice had gone quiet, which probably meant the boy had fallen asleep in the hay with his dog, which had happened twice before, and which would probably happen again. There was a thing Gideon had learned over the course of one winter and one spring, and now the long back of a summer, that he had not been able to learn alone, which was that the measure of a life was not the absence of difficulty. He had tried that measure for 3 years, managing every difficulty, surviving every winter, holding everything together through force of will, and it had produced a life that was functional and empty in equal parts. The measure was something else, something harder to name and easier to know when you were living in it. It was whether the difficulty was shared, whether the good things had somewhere to land, whether the work you did each day was building something or just maintaining something, and whether the difference between those two things could be felt from the inside. He had been maintaining for a long time. He was building now. That was the truth of it, plain and undramatic and entirely sufficient. The woman who had arrived on a frozen platform on a December afternoon, with 4 boys behind her and a carpetbag in her hand, and the straight-back composure of someone who had been getting through things alone for so long that she had almost forgotten there was another way, had not saved him in any of the dramatic senses of that word. She had not arrived and immediately made everything better. She had arrived and been difficult, and been capable, and been honest, and been present, and so had he. And between the 2 of them and 4 boys and 1 foreman who cried at drawings of barns and 1 dog named after the wrong month, something had accumulated that was too solid to be called anything other than what it was. Clara set down her coffee cup and stood up and said, "Noah's in the barn again." "I know," Gideon said. "Are you going to get him?" "In a minute," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside and he sat at the table a little longer, in the August dark, with the stars and the windmill and the grassland going black at the edges, and the sound of the ranch settling into its nighttime self around him. Then he got up and went to get his son. Not the word he'd used before, not the word he'd been careful around, not the word he'd qualified every time it approached. Just the word, plain, the way true things went when you finally stopped finding reasons to complicate them. He got his son out of the barn, Noah, half asleep, with hay in his hair and December at his heels, and walked him across the yard and into the house. And the house was warm and lit and full of the sounds of people who lived in it. And Gideon Voss walked through the door he had been walking through for 15 years and felt, for the first time, that he was arriving.